California is a garden of Eden, a paradise to live in or see. But believe it or not, you won't find it so hot if you ain't got the do-re-mi.
I'm Mark Paul, Senior Scholar at the New America Foundation. Once again, California's elected leaders have tossed the budget hot potato into our laps. On May 19, we voters will be asked in a special election to decide 6 measures placed on the ballot in the budget deal struck in late February by the legislature and governor. As is so often the case, the measures on the ballot require us to make sense of some of the most complex issues in state government. We will be deciding whether to reform the very reforms we were once told would solve California's problems. We are being asked to rewrite the state spending limit, its rainy day budget reserve, the Proposition 98 minimum funding guarantee for schools, the California lottery, and programs we earlier approved to finance mental health and early childhood programs. Proposition 1A would also extend the length of the temporary tax increases enacted as part of the budget. So where should we start in making a decision? My prejudice is that sometimes you can better understand where you are and where you want to go if you know where you're coming from. So let's look together at where California state finances have been over the last 3 decades since Proposition 13 transformed our state. Let's start with spending. We've heard a lot about overspending and about big government. But as you can see here in the green line, California's general fund spending, measured as a share of our income, is lower today than it was 30 years ago. It has moved in a narrow range over the last 3 decades, swinging far less than the size of the federal budget, as you can see from the blue line at the top of the chart. So, as fierce as they've been, our California budget debates are quarrels over about 1 penny of every dollar of state output. The biggest spending change over the last 3 decades has been in our priorities. In 1985, schools were the largest spending item, with higher education and health care tied for second place. Here's the same chart for 2008, the last full fiscal year. Schools remain the top priority, with about the same share of the budget as in 1985. And healthcare remains the second priority. Its share of the budget has grown, the result of the inexorable rise in healthcare costs afflicting all of us. But the biggest growth item has been criminal justice, a reflection of the huge increase in the state's prison population. Prisons have gobbled up big shares of the budget that used to go to higher education, social services, and general government. If we were to use these budget priorities to infer California's mission statement, you'd say that California educates, medicates, and incarcerates. The tax story is similar to the spending story. The state tax burden, the share of income that we Californians pay to the state, has moved in a narrow range of about 1 penny. Again, you'll see the much bigger swings in the federal tax burden, the blue line. In 2008, California state taxes as a share of total personal income were at the same level as in 1987. The biggest swings in the green line come not from policy changes, but from the 2 great asset bubbles, the stock bubble and the housing bubble of the last decade, which yielded enormous revenues from capital gains. Just as the composition of state spending has changed, so has the composition of state revenues. California's estate tax was repealed by voters, and the residual federal credit disappeared with the Bush tax cuts. the corporation income tax rate has been cut. Increases in tax rates on alcohol and tobacco have been more than offset by decreases in smoking and drinking. The vehicle license fee, the so-called car tax, was raised in the early 1990s crisis, then cut again in the boom years at the end of that decade. Tax rates on gasoline and other fuels were raised twice, but have not kept up with inflation. The state sales tax was raised under Pete Wilson, but the state sales tax burden, we can see here, has actually declined. Californians have shifted their consumption away from tangible goods like clothing and lawnmowers, which are taxed, to services like gym memberships and gardeners, which are not. We've moved away from CDs and VHS tapes in favor of intangible goods like downloaded music and movies, which are not taxed or can escape taxation. Taken together, these economic changes and tax cuts significantly eroded the tax base over this period. Under normal circumstances, this erosion would have started causing big budget problems a decade ago. Just look at the slope of that red line. Except that the erosion was temporarily masked by an enormous surge in personal income tax revenue, driven by the internet stock bubble. This surge came not as the result of policy. California's top tax rates are actually lower than they were 30 years ago, and the state raised the dependent credit in 1997, cutting the taxes of middle-class families. No, the surge was driven entirely by economic factors. Since 1979, households at the 90th percentile and every level below it have lost income share to the top 10% and mostly to the richest 1%. Nationally, the top 10% of households receive about as much income as all the households in the bottom 80% combined. California's income tax brings in growing sums because lots more of the income, and almost all of the income growth, has gone to people liable for income tax. When the internet bubble burst in 2001, California's structural deficit was exposed. This chart shows the state's annual operating balance for the last decade. Over that decade, the state has spent about $26 billion more than it has taken in tax revenues. Instead of closing this deficit, the governor and the legislature papered it over. They made the cut in the vehicle license fee permanent and borrowed to cover over the problem, with voters' assent in 2004, let us remember. As a result, California now faces a double budget whammy: an existing structural deficit and an additional recession-driven deficit, the product of revenues that have fallen by 10% across all the big revenue sources as the economy has shrunk. The alignment of these two deficits, one piled on top of the other, is the context for the May special election ballot. One final note. The measures on the May ballot do a lot of things. They allow the state to borrow to fill some of the recession deficit. They extend some of the temporary taxes for 2 years. They temporarily pull some money out of special funds and let it be used for schools, health care, and prisons. But there are no permanent tax increases or permanent spending cuts. Even if the voters approve every measure in May, they will do no more than kick the can down the road. The structural deficit will remain, and California will still have big work to do to restore fiscal stability, as this projection from the legislative analyst shows. Thanks for watching, and happy voting.
California is a garden of Eden, a paradise to live in or see. But believe it or not, you won't find it so hot if you ain't got the do-re-mi.